get started. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for showing up. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Tom Ashcraft. I am the MFA director here at the School of Art and Design. And we are kicking off the year's Visiting Artist schedule. And our first speaker today is Sandy Williams IV. So I'm really glad to have you here. I'm going to read a little bit about Sandy's background and let Sandy take it away. If you're in the hallways and you're walking around, you see these beautiful pink and purple posters of Visiting Artist schedule that our very own Jillian All made. Raise your hand, stand up if people know Jillian. If you don't know her, just go meet her. She's a great person. The door is always open if she's on campus. But she made beautiful posters. Pay attention to who's talking, and please come, tell your friends. It's a really wonderful resource that the school has for you all. It's an amazing resource. So, thank you, Jillian.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. So, Sandy, thank you for coming today. Sandy is an artist and an educator whose practice is deeply interdisciplinary, incorporating layers of contextual research, community activity, collaboration, civic action, and performance. There's a lot of parts to their practice. Their work frequently navigates outside of the traditional gallery and the gallery space and into like a meridian of public spaces. It's pretty interesting. Places of education and worship, fashion, virtual portals, and even a project in the sky. Can you show that today?
Yes.
Okay, good. That's a wonderful piece. So a little bit Sandy's education. I found out Sandy's from Virginia Beach, Virginia. Went to UVA, University of Virginia, from studio art, and got their MFA in sculpture and extended media at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond. Lots of solo shows, group shows. I'll read off a few. Work shown recently at the Telematic Arts in San Francisco, California, the Weeksville Heritage Center in Brooklyn, New York, Cultural DC in Washington, DC. It's a great place, by the way. Gallery 1708 in 1708 Gallery in Richmond, another wonderful place, and the NADA House Governor's Island, and the new Release Gallery in New York City. Grounds for Sculpture in Hamilton, New York, shown in Los Angeles, showed in the Virginia Museum of Contemporary Art, so on and so forth. There's lots of work shown nationally and internationally. That's quite a light. Film screenings, number of film screenings in Padua, Italy, Lafayette, Louisiana, New York City, a host of residencies, McDowell Colony, the most recent, Mass Mocha Artist Residency in North Adams, Maine, the Socrates Sculpture Park Emerging Artist Fellowship in Queens, New York. Socrates Sculpture Park is really great space. Variety of work in a variety of collections, Virginia Museum of Art, the Harnett Museum at the University of Richmond, and one that I found particularly interesting, the Roanoke College Memorial to Enslaved Laborers. I'd like to know more about that. Lots of grants and awards, Distinguished Educator Award, where Sandy currently teaches at the University of Richmond. And the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts Visual Arts Fellowship, and on and on and on. Very accomplished. We're very fortunate to have Sandy here kicking off our Visiting Artist Lecture Series. So would you please welcome me and joining us in all welcoming this guy. This person.
Cool. Thank you all for being here. I'm excited to talk about some of the work. We only have an hour, and I want to leave time for questions and things, so I'm going to kind of like jump around and kind of pop through things. I'm not gonna show everything, but I kind of focus this presentation on my public art. So I'll kind of go through that. Like if there's questions about kind of other spaces in my practice, I can pull other things up during the Q&A portion. And I'm pretty casual, you know, like if you do have a question while I'm talking, you can throw it at me, I don't mind. Or you can hold it to the end and I'll leave space for that. So yeah, like we said, I'm Sandy, Virginia Beach to Charlottesville to Richmond, now I teach in Richmond, so I'm all Virginia, which I think is like interesting and important context for a lot of the work that I'm gonna talk about. I think these days I'm most known for this Wax Monument series, so that's where I started. I started this series in 2017. I consider it my entry into public art. At the time, I was just finished with, and you know, some of y'all were in this intro class where I told a lot of these stories earlier, so bear with me here. Feign interest. But yeah, I had just finished my studio art undergraduate degree in Charlottesville. And in 2017 is when the Unite the Right rally happens in Charlottesville. I realized also earlier that some of our younger students don't know about that event, but it was a white nationalist rally that happened around the proposed removal of a Robert E. Lee statue in Charlottesville, Virginia. So the city was talking about removing this sculpture. At the beginning of the summer, this coalition starts to form that is really against the idea of removing the image of Robert E. Lee. Having, like I said, grown up in Virginia and lived there all my life, I wasn't unfamiliar with these sentiments of sort of lost cause ideology, love for the Confederacy. You know, I had plenty of classmates that came to school with the Confederate flag in their backpacks. So it never struck me as, you know, like it wasn't my politic, but it never necessarily like struck me as something that was a true problem that I personally needed to take on myself. Until this rally happened. So I'm living in Charlottesville, I'm there that morning when this rally starts to form. The night before, they sort of stormed the campus of the university. There's famous images of them with like their Target, Walmart tiki torches. But it was serious, like I had friends who were assaulted that night, people still dealing with kind of health issues from those events. And the next day, they have the planned kind of protest at the Robert E. Lee statue itself. So I'm going to work that morning. I was waiting tables at the time, kind of like walking a few blocks away from where this statue is and where this rally is supposed to happen. A truckload of guys in a pickup truck with Confederate and Nazi flags on it ride by me and throw Nazi salutes at me. And there's like police officers, I'm like walking past the 7-Eleven, there's police officers standing there, they see all this happen, I look at them, they kind of shrug at me, and that's why I was like, okay, it's about to get crazy here, and they're not prepared. And it was like, you know, like handmade flamethrowers, you know, all types of weapons being brandished, like fist fights. A man drives his car through a crowd of people and kills a woman, Heather Heyer. And we watch all this happen live and then on TV that day and for years. But it's this moment so that morning I left Charlottesville before everything started happening, and I went to Richmond. I'd already gotten into grad school where I was starting my graduate studies around sculpture. And this is, you know, I leave Charlottesville where we have this Robert E. Lee monument and other very problematic monuments that are still there, to Richmond where they have an entire famous Monument Avenue. So the conversations around what these objects are doing become unavoidable. Like, it was this moment for me to be like, there is something happening here. There is a sort of violence that is centered around these memorials to war, to violence, to, you know, I think we can project a lot of different symbolism onto these things at this point. And I'm interested in a way that for most of my life, these things were just so normalized that it was hard to confront. But yeah, so we're having all these conversations around these monuments, what they mean, what they're doing, and what we would want in our public spaces instead, I think was a focus of the community. You know, we're going to these town hall meetings, voicing our opinions, voicing our distaste. You know, I think the conversation was like, remove it, leave it, or recontextualize it. It was sort of like put up a plaque that says something. And at the end of months of these letter writing campaigns and petitions, etc., the city's kind of like, you know, thanks for your opinions, we're actually not going to do anything. They sort of placated with the, they told us it was like federal property, so the state or the city actually didn't have jurisdiction. It turned out that wasn't true. There was like one that had that sort of case, but the rest of them, the city did have the power to do things. And in 2020, when people just started pulling them down, they did. But this is 2017, 2018, when I think in that moment, I was like, not only are these things a problem, but as a community, we actually don't have much agency in forming what our public spaces look like. Like, we have all these things imposed on us, all of these things that we live with, that affect us, invisibly and visibly, but we don't have so much power to do anything about it, I think was my real issue. Like, I had friends who just did a performance in front of, the far left one is the Robert E. Lee Monument in Richmond, who were arrested just for doing a performance in front of it. So it's this heavily red-taped space, our public spaces, that is sort of romanticized or talked about as free space. You know, we like to think of ourselves as the land of the free. But the more I was doing these public space interventions and like my friends were as well, it became so apparent how little freedom there actually was. So that's kind of like where this work is born, is this wax monument series where I say, okay, a monument is, in our like Western culture, is doing a few things. Like, it's permanent in its material so that it can hold space indefinitely. It's monumental in its size so that it imposes a certain presence on us and on our environments. And it's typically singular in form so that it is this sort of reified, this special rarefied object that people want to come from all, like, it was a big part of Richmond's tourism. For as long as those monuments were there, people would come as a sort of pilgrimage to see these things, to pay homage to both the Confederacy, but then the living sort of white nationalism, white supremacy that we still live with today. So to flip that on its head, I say, okay, well, I should have disabled that. To flip that on its head, I say, okay, so let's make it then ephemeral in its material by making it wax, miniature in its size so that it is more mobile, and then multiple in its form also so that it can be distributed. All in an effort to create agency around these public forums in a way that didn't exist at the time. And yeah, I saw, I think, some speculation on how that's done, so I 3D scanned them. Like, the first one I 3D scanned was this little yellow one, is Thomas Jefferson. He's like the monument of Charlottesville that I would love to tear down, but yeah, so there's this Jefferson statue on the lawn at UVA. I'm like with a little handheld 3D scanner on an iPad, like climbing a tree to get all the angles for it before I got more techy. 3D scanning it, 3D printing it at a miniature size, making a mold of that. You know, then you take the 3D print out and you pour wax into that mold. I liked this process also because in my undergraduate sculpture studies, you know, we did bronze casting and we went through the lost wax process. The lost wax process is similar in that, yeah, you make most, you know, it's the traditional way to make a bronze monument or statue or figure is to make a wax of it, make a mold with sand and plaster, melt out the wax, and then pour bronze into that mold. So in a way, I was thinking, this is also a way of reversing the time on these bronze monuments. It's taking them back to the state when they were still malleable, when there was still potential for them to be something else, like in an approachable way. Like you can still melt down bronze, but that's besides the point. So yeah, started by making these sculptures. I started with Jefferson. Then it got to the Confederate monuments in Richmond. Like there were architecture companies kind of like 3D scanning them as a sort of archival, kind of archiving them. And for me, when I was showing those works in galleries, which are very like sort of blue leftist sort of spaces, I felt like the conversation was really centered around like burn down those Confederate statues. But for me, like the conversation was bigger than that. It was really looking at the overall culture of memorialization that we have in the United States. Not just the Confederate ones, but in general, the way we use iconography and symbolism to create a sort of national narrative. That the more I was looking at it is such a false narrative for what actually our history is. And that includes Lincoln as well. So I pulled Lincoln into it. And since then, the series has been growing. This is an installation that's at Grounds for Sculpture in New Jersey right now. Just to describe it, like I took the inspiration from the stairs at the Lincoln Memorial and sort of made a replica of those for these little monuments then to be installed and melted on. So it's there for 1.5 years. They're like melting it on they're setting their own schedule for it. But yeah, now it has Mount Rushmore, it has Christopher Columbus, it has all the Confederate ones that were in Richmond. It has MLK as well. Like after Lincoln, I sort of just, we talked about Monument Lab is an organization that I did this project with. They commissioned this for this group show about monuments and like our changing landscape in the United States as it has become. And they became famous a few years ago for doing this sort of survey of national monuments in the United States, like of all of our monuments in the United States, and they now have a database that you can go and sort of search. You can like localize it by state or by city, but through that I found like the most memorialized figures in the United States, and that's kind of like where I've grown this series out of. It's like Christopher Columbus is in there, MLK is in there. The Statue of Liberty was also put in. It's just like iconic American symbols and monuments. People also often ask me like, well, what about insert obscure figure monument in my town? Which is a little less interesting to me. I think like I've sort of settled into these like very large icons as a way of talking about American monument culture. I think like the more it adds like just like the one monument in blah 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 place, and it might kind of dilute the effect of what the conversation is here. And then I chose the stairs at the Lincoln Memorial because I was thinking, that is also a civic space for us in so many ways, like from the Million Man March with Martin Luther King to like the insurrection where they're storming those stairs. It has been this place that sort of contrasts the realities of our dynamics, our politics, our social environments in the United States against the sort of picturesque, sort of symbolic portrayal of like the land of the free, home of the brave. So in 2020, I get the opportunity to do a public version of these wax monuments. This is at Socrates Sculpture Park. They have an open call every year for those interested in how these things happen. Yeah, this was an open call. I applied with this idea to create a public monument using kind of my little figures as an example of what the symbolic effect of the work is. the budget wasn't substantial, so I had to pick a form that I could construct by myself. So I made this by just building walls of like linoleum wood, like linoleum lined wood. I kind of zigzagged them, and then over the course of weeks was casting this in layers by myself. I had like turkey fryer, kind of like propane setups in buckets every day. Like I would teach class in the morning on Zoom, and then drive out to the park and like melt 200 pounds of wax, and this is 3,000 pounds of wax total. It's 6 feet tall by 11 feet wide. And yeah, like I did that on like a $5,000 budget, just like by not paying myself, which I don't recommend, but here we are. And so yeah, it was the first opportunity to really like see this thing as a public installation. Like the smaller ones were ways to sort of distribute sort of private or personal agency around these forms. And I saw this as a way of opening up a sort of shared democracy around our public space. So like this was an opportunity for us to come to this thing that was this public memorial or monument or structure, whatever you want to call it, and touch it in a way that you normally can't, and affect it. I think often when I was describing this work, you know, because I was like, yeah, it's going to be a US flag, it's going to be black and white, it's going to be full of wicks, and we're going to melt it over the course of that 6-month installation. I think people often imagine like a flag burning, but unless it's like a very still day, it's really, to keep that wick lit actually takes a lot of investment. Like you have to stay there with it, you have to shield it from the wind. So it becomes a more contemplative space, sort of vigil-esque. So I kind of typically say, you know, like, it can go from effigy to memorial depending on what you bring to these structures. Like, if you bring that energy of effigy and light every wick on it, it can become that thing that is more destructive. Versus if you come with sort of just a meditation and light one wick and sit with that thing, it is a different energy. That's also to say that I'm always with these things, I'm no cop. You know, like once I put this thing out there, it is part of the community. I'm not here to sort of build my own red tape around how this thing then lives. And so I think of my work as sort of a labor of love, and that, yeah, I was out there every day pouring wax myself, building this structure for then people to do with what they wanted to. And after that, I sort of take my sort of authorship around what the intentions of that work are. I withhold that so that it can be just part of the community, and what is meant to happen to it is what happens. Or what happens is what is meant to happen to it. So yeah, this was installed for 6 months. At the end of that 6 months, it was just a pile of wax that I came to pick up. Often, typically, I recycle the wax back into new projects. And it was cool, you know, like I really was expecting it to be controversial. And people really liked it. Like the community liked it, like kids came to the park every day. There's like a nice community around that park that visits it often, and you know they really value their green spaces. And the kids like had a little trading system around like the drippings of the wax, and it was kind of a positive. Some of my other public projects, like the police have been called 5 times on my art, and like it doesn't always go well. For my students, I say like, if you're ever not sure if you're supposed to be doing what you're doing, just tell people you're a student and they kind of like let you do it. The next thing is to wear like a safety vest so that people think you're labor and then you become invisible. But yeah, don't tell them you're doing like an art project. They will call them, yeah, they don't like that. So this kind of leads into work that I've been doing more recently, and I'm kind of like also, well, not too late, but. So I did a project in Richmond, Virginia at what is Chimborazo Park. Chimborazo Park is remembered as the largest Confederate hospital during the Civil War, which is 4 years in, you know, an eon of what that space was. Like, for thousands of years, it was home to the Powhatan Confederacy, before, like, you know, English settlers come and make it Virginia, and then make it Richmond, and then Richmond becomes the capital of the Confederacy. And then after the Confederacy is dismantled, it's a freedmen community. So freedmen communities were established by the Freedmen's Bureau. It was a big part of the emancipation of enslaved people, was that we have to enfranchise them, you know, like part of that has to be repaired. You can't just free everyone and make them homeless. And so we had a Freedmen's Bureau, it was federally funded, that was charged with creating communities for formerly enslaved people. So Chimborazo Park was one of those spaces. The 200 hospital buildings that were there become homes, become schools. This is 1865. In April is when they're given this space to start building community. And at the same time, Richmond's sort of white elite and etc. Are rebuilding their own power. So the mayor that was mayor before the start of the Civil War is reelected. You know, he's proposing bringing back the whipping post and things. Lincoln is assassinated. Johnson, who steps in, is very pro-white landowner and starts dismantling these acts of reparation. So in Richmond, they make it illegal to be homeless around January of 1866. They say if you're arrested for being homeless or vagrant, you don't go to jail, you go to work camps, which are coincidentally where the former plantations were. And then in April, like days before this community is meant to celebrate their first year of freedom, they dismantle the freedmen's community, they make it illegal to be there, they make everyone there homeless, and they either start arresting people, just start pushing them out, or they're doing things like buying them one-way tickets to Philly or Chicago. And this is just like a small Wikipedia entry about the park. Like, you know, there's like a long history about the Confederate history there, and then there's just like this small paragraph about like, and then it was a freedmen community, and then it was a park. It really skips over this part very intentionally. And so I was asked to do a project at Chimborazo Park for 728 Gallery. Has this like in-light festival every year that's kind of like, it's a night of art in lights is kind of like what they propose it to be. So I was asked to kind of do an installation. So I start all my work with doing contextual research, all my public work, to sort of understand the space and what I'm bringing there. I'm not really like I've done this thing here, so I'm just gonna plop that thing there. I really like tried to make the thing respond to the space and the community that's gonna steward the work. So yeah, I'm doing this research about this park. I find this history and don't really know what to do with it at the time. Like I didn't, for Inlight, I ended up doing this performance where there's like a small Statue of Liberty there that I just proposed. This is 2020, so it's like right around when, you know, after George Floyd's murder, right around when we're like pulling things off the pedestals and things, so it's a hot topic to be touching monuments at the time. So I just proposed we clean the statue. You know, it's been there, it was put there in the 1950s by the Boy Scouts of Robert E. Lee. And it was really interesting to me that, yeah, in the 50s during segregation in the United States, the Statue of Liberty is like, comes from Libertas, it's like a Roman goddess of emancipation, who then like, through the years becomes this icon for like the United States in this way that's like, so she goes from being like the goddess of emancipation to like the goddess of white landowners in the Americas, to being like this icon for white children to erect during segregation, and then it's just sitting there for 70 plus years, and before I come to like interact with this thing. So I was like, it's so interesting that this thing has been here for so long. It's gone through so many different transformations of what the symbolics of that form mean. What if we just clean it? It's sitting here, it's been collecting patina. What would it mean to just, as a community, touch this thing and pull it into the contemporary and just show that we at least care about it? That was the first time the police called on me, because I was like scrubbing this thing outside, and this guy pedals up in like sandals and socks and like tells me I'm vandalizing the thing, and I find out the patina was very important to him, and he lives across the street and feels ownership over this space. So again, it was like being confronted with not only the bureaucratic red tape around this space, but also the social red tape of like, we also socially police each other in these spaces to kind of, to uphold these structures that exist. So anyways, at that same time, I'm in grad school, and I had this idea around the idea of reparations. In addition to these freedmen communities, from South Carolina to Florida, there's the 40 Acres Act that people might have heard of, 40 acres and a mule, actually happened. So 400,000 acres of land were given to 40,000 black people, families, along that coastline. Again, they sort of maintained it for about a year before that act is revoked. All that land goes back to the former white landowners, and again, people are kind of just displaced and made homeless, and that history is erased to the point where people don't even know that actually happened. Like, it lives now as a myth, especially in the Black diaspora, of sort of like the promise of reparations, or the dream of what that repair might have looked like. And so I had written this score in my studio of like, draw 40 acres in the sky, document it from multiple angles, and let it dissipate back into the atmosphere as a way of sort of symbolically, I felt like that's symbolically what happened, like these communities disappeared, but that memory still exists in the atmosphere, so in the same way. So anyways, I had this idea for the skywriting. At the same time, it was just kind of like a poem that I taped up on my studio wall as kind of like, it's a score, it's conceptual, you get it. And I guess years later, I was like, oh, do the skywriting above the former freedmen community. So that's kind of how this came about. A year after that performance, I approached the curator at 1708, where I did the other performance, who I did the other performance with, about this project. If you don't know, skywritings are expensive. Like, this was probably like $15,000 we needed to come up with to get somebody to draw this thing in the sky for 5 minutes. So yeah, I worked with 1708 Gallery. I did my own fundraisers. We found other community partners to sort of sponsor this event, where we traced the dimensions of 40 acres in the sky above the freedmen community as a way of connecting that regional history of repair, or a lack thereof, to this sort of national, broader history of, a lack of repair across the country. And again, sort of the way that lives now in our contemporary, like the way we still deal with, like that system of like making people homeless, arresting them for being homeless, is what our mass incarceration system gets built out of. Like, that's when it starts, is right after the Civil War. So it's thinking about all the repercussions of that and the ways we live with them. Also, like, yeah, this place becomes a park right after that. It's still illegal to camp out or sleep in that park. Again, that was like a Civil War era law that was made. At this time also, they're printing in the newspaper like, my tax dollars shouldn't be going to an able-bodied person who needs to just get a job. Again, that's like rhetoric we hear today as sort of like a conservative, like anti-welfare thing. But it's been disconnected from its like very specific anti-blackness. Like, literally, like, we still know what people are talking about when they say that, but it's been disconnected from like the history that it's really rooted in, intentionally. like even like the CRT that we're living, moment that we're living through now, it's like all ways of disconnecting us from the truth of why things are the way they are. And that's really where I get into history as part of my art practice, because I'm like, you know, understanding these things actually makes the space make sense, you know. I think oftentimes what we're living in and through can feel really confusing. But if you just like look back and look at what people wrote about the times, like they documented it very well. Like it's actually kind of simple. So anyways, this is the event that we had around the skywriting. Like we invited people out. The skywriter drew it 3 times in the sky. Let it dissipate, drew the second one, let it dissipate. Those are some of my students that came out for the event. For this and like all the following projects, I'm working with a student researcher at the University of Richmond. Like he started there as a freshman my first year at the university, so we've kind of been like, like going through our time at the university together. But yeah, we distributed pamphlets to kind of tell these stories, like all these different things, all these different stories we found in like newspaper and art and the archival newspapers from the times. And just, you know, like had all of our sources, had all the stories just for folks to disseminate this information. I think that's such a big focus of what becomes this thing I'm working on called the 40 Acres Archive. But it's like using art as a vehicle to have these conversations around like our history and our contemporary and our public spaces. We then did an exhibition of sort of the documentation of the work. I think that's also an important note, is like a lot of the work I'm doing is ephemeral in the ways that it happens. So, you know, it's like this skywriting performance that maybe you could call a sculpture if we want to think about the material of it. But then there's a film that comes from it, but then there's photography that comes from it, but then there's installation that comes from it. So like we had kind of these bleacher benches out there for the skywriting as a way of also like kind of like it's like a space launch or something, and we all come out to watch this thing. But then we had that in the gallery as we had a visual prompt, and we had the real grass that died over the course of the exhibition. So you could come and watch the film of the skywriting on the bleachers. We made a book from the documentation. And then we also went through the bureaucratic process of getting a historical marker placed at the park to recognize this community. This took 2 years, so like we applied with all the research we did for the project and the pamphlets to the city. We got rejected the first time. In this exhibition, I actually showed our rejection letter and the sort of rendering of what we wanted to be there. Some of the people from the historical marker committee that rejected us came to the exhibition, and we got approved after. It was like, so cool, what a coincidence. So yeah, this in 2022, no, more recently, 24, we applied into 2022, and in 2024 we installed this and had an unveiling for it. So again, just to sort of give you all the different ways that the archive is thinking about this work. Also working on a website that connects all the different projects. Like this started in 2021. And so in these past 3 years, we've done about 6 projects around the country, or along the East Coast mostly. The last one was, well, I'll get to the very most recent one. We also did this 40 Acres Weeksville, was in Brooklyn, New York. Weeksville is remembered as one of the first free Black communities in the country. So around the 1830s, Black people are given the right to own land in New York, and so people start doing that and they start building community. I think also in the ways Black history is often talked about in the United States, it's like one of subjugation, and not one of agency that really tells the stories of like the first generation of free people was amazing. Like because they were doing all of the work in most of the communities, like you know they were good at things. So they were doctors, they were engineers, they were teachers, etc. So they were able to, they came together, they built a community that was Brooklyn before Brooklyn was there. It's kind of like erased in kind of urban renewal projects and then rediscovered in the 60s, ironically by like a flyover, like there was this person kind of doing archival investigations into the area and was flying over that space in a plane, again like Crown Heights, Brooklyn, and sees that there's this row of houses that are facing a different direction than all the other ones, and once they start to excavate and understand it, they're like, oh, there was this whole community here that we forgot about. Now they have a heritage center there that's been built up over the decades. So I worked with that heritage center, and the Shed is an institution in Manhattan, New York. Again, so this was through an open call. The Shed like has an open call program that's like, we have $15K for you to do a project. I was like, that's how much a skywriting costs. So they said yes, and then I approached Weeksville about the project. They were super excited. So on Juneteenth, which is like our kind of like National Emancipation Day, again, like that was the last day like enslaved people in Texas found out that they were free. But each region has its own kind of Freedom Day because it was happening at different times across the country. But yeah, on Juneteenth, they had a food and music festival. We had another skywriting where we traced the dimensions of Weeksville in the sky above where it used to be. Produced a film of that that's been kind of traveling all around the world. It showed in Italy this summer. It's going to show in Buffalo, New York next month. So yeah, there's like, we've had all of these different projects at different places that are being connected through the website and the research. The most recent one that just finished was 40 Acres Camp Barker. Camp Barker was again a Civil War era freedmen community in DC that Lincoln used to ride past and visit on like his visits between the White House and Lincoln's cottage. And again, it was this community that nobody really knew about. Like so often at these events, there's people that have lived in the space all their life and have never heard these stories. Which I think, like again, is kind of the way we tell history, and especially the way we tell history through these large symbolic kind of monoliths without really understanding the details. So going back to it, I thought the flag was going to be really controversial. I was like, we're melting a US flag. Patriots don't like that. But Lincoln is always the most controversial figure for people. Like, I get more like question marks and upset like sort of letters from people about melting Lincoln. And I think it's because he's so connected to this sort of liberal ideal of like, like we learn Lincoln freed the slaves, and like he's the great emancipator. We don't learn that Lincoln had no interest in freeing enslaved people. Like in his own words, he was kind of like, the Emancipation Proclamation is a military doctrine, like it's only out of military necessity that I'm writing this thing. Like if I had a choice, I would not free like enslaved people. I don't think it's the right time, but we just have to, and I'm sure he's like playing politics and placating, but that's just to say like we don't learn that, right? We don't learn about all of the black people around him that really encouraged him. We don't learn about like the hundreds of years of emancipation work that happened that lead up to Lincoln writing, like signing his name on that doctrine. Or even the exclusions, like there were a lot of states that did not have to free anyone. Like it was only rebel states that whose slaves were freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Like, and if you were in the Union, you could keep your slaves. So I think like Lincoln sits as this monolith of history and how we understand like the Civil War and the Reconstruction era that obscures everything around him. So the idea was to melt Lincoln's monument in a place where there's a history that we need to understand better. And this, like, there's so many crazy stories attached to this, because yeah, like, I worked with Cultural DC. Let me check my time. All right, we're kind of at question time, but I'll say it quickly. Yeah, I was working with Cultural DC. We identified like several different Freedmen communities in DC that we could kind of acknowledge and do this project at, because we were applying for a grant through the city of DC. The director of Cultural DC was like, oh, my daughter goes to an elementary school that sits on this one Freedmen community. She reached out to the principal. He was like, definitely, like, I'd love to do that. And I was like, what a progressive elementary school that wants to like melt a founding father, like with a bunch of, you know, children. I wish that was my elementary school. And so maybe I was a little overzealous, but yeah, I was like, all right, let's put like 100 wicks in this thing so it can really melt. You know, we really wanted to transform over the course of the installation. And everybody was like, this sounds great. So we put it outside. You know, it takes a year to produce this thing because it's a lot of processes of making the model, making the mold, like everything I said, but on a monumental scale. This is 6 feet by 6 feet. It's getting like 3,000 pounds. We put it outside. There's a tropical storm that comes through DC that cancels our unveiling, so we don't put out our signs and our didactics, and we don't have the unveiling event we're supposed to have with the students. Like, we're supposed to have a little pep rally where we really like hyped it up and like told them what was gonna happen and kind of talked about like our shared responsibility over the thing. So we reschedule it for like a week or two later, and like days later, there's like this art walk that happens around DC, and some adults happen upon this wax form, unprompted, and they're like, this thing has wicks. And they light every wick on it, leave it burning for days. So like this is over the weekend, like the kids come into school on Monday, and like he's still burning. So one of the neighbors who was adamant from the start that we shouldn't do this project in the first place, he was like, this is gonna be terrible for you. Fox News is gonna be all over this. Calls the police bring the fire department hoses it down, so there's wax everywhere, and the police are there, and then some of the kids are crying, and so then the news crews show up because they're like, we gotta get those kids on camera. So there's like a news story about like this whole thing, it's a debacle, so the principal's like, you gotta get this thing out of there. And they're kind of coming to me like, why'd you melt his head off? And I was like, there is not one Lincoln with a head on it on my website. You know, you called the melting monument person. I thought we were on the same page. You know, you saw the wicks. Like I said, I thought we were just very all progressive. So we have to remove it. They're all like, we're like, the project's scrapped, we're done. But you know, we like put a year into this thing, so I write all these letters, like really convincing people, you know, I'm like, you know, wouldn't persevering really honor Lincoln's legacy? You know, dealt with a lot of controversial things, and they're like, okay. But like the new one, the deal was it could only have 10 wicks this time. None in the face and none in the chest. They're like, we don't want it to look like you got shot in the head or the face. Or in the chest, so like just place them, you know, one in the hand, like one in the leg. So this was kind of like our unveiling of the second one with the 10 wicks, with all the kids. We had our pep rally with like the art students. We came and like did a little thing. And then it just sat there, you know, like this was we installed the first one in October. The second one got installed in February. It kind of sits there. Like one of the hands falls off, so I just have the hand. Randomly, somebody stole one of the legs, which is a feat because it's like a few hundred pounds, like the legs of it. So like, just one morning we came and there was no leg. But again, you know, I'm no cop. I'm like, well, what are we gonna do? And then randomly it comes back days later. The leg was just back. The best theory somebody gave me was like, probably a group of kids stole it and were hiding it in their closet, and then the parent found it and told them to put it back. I really hope one day I find out what happened with that leg. This is more unveiling things. And then like, have y'all seen this? Okay, yeah, so then like, it started starts melting just from the heat. So yeah, like from 2020 to here 2024, like I've been doing these outdoor monuments. I've been using this wax that's like rated at 140 degrees congealing point, so they're not supposed to melt outside, and they hadn't. And like all through those years, people kept being like, isn't it gonna melt? And I'd always be like, well, like if it does melt outside, like we've got bigger problems than the sculpture melting. It's like, that means it's 140 degrees outside. It wasn't 140 degrees, but it was like consistently around 100-degree weather in DC. And I will like say like it probably wasn't the best idea to have like an aluminum plate under it. Hindsight. But anyways, it starts melting. Like then there's memes like circulating around the internet. Cause like I was out of town, like I was in Italy for the film screening. And then I start getting these like texts from people like, hey, like I saw your sculpture like on name a meme page or something. Actually, first I got an email for someone being like, I think someone vandalized your sculpture and tried to cut Lincoln's head off. They sent me all these pictures. I was like, I think it's melting. And then like the next day, like yeah, I start getting the memes, and I'm like, oh, like it's really melting. And yeah, it goes viral. Like it goes like I got things from like Indonesia, from India, from Korea, from Japan. I met people in Portugal that like had seen this, and then it's like the Washington Post, and then it's like New York Magazine, and then New York Times, and then BBC. So it went crazy, and like for me, for them it was like about the sort of like humor of it and the memes of it, and like you know people were like, oh like it looks like he's getting a blowjob. It looks like somebody's like, oh that's me like when I get off work on Friday. Or they're like, that's like an accurate telling of Lincoln's history because like his head fell off. But yeah, for me it was like, you know, it was really about like the climate change. I was like, you know, all that is funny, but that was not supposed to melt. And you know, that was like the big question people were DMing me was like, what kind of idiot puts wax outside? And I was like, well, it was kind of the point, but because I had signed all those documents saying I wasn't gonna melt this Lincoln, I couldn't be like, yeah, we wanted it to melt. So it was like a real dance of, but anyways, that's kind of like, I wanna leave time for questions. That's kind of like where my public art practice is at. Questions? Yes.
What's been your favorite project?
No one's ever asked me that. You know, I don't, it's like your kids, you know? Like you can't really pick a favorite. They all do their own thing. Like this was the most popular one. Like it got the most attention. But it's part of like a series of works that are all connected. So it's also hard for me to like separate them out. I think like they each inform each other in different ways that early on in my practice, like in grad school and undergrad especially, like people were like, what do you do? Like, cause I had like the films here and then the sculptures here and then I was performing sometimes and I was making clothes. And I think through making more and more things, like they've come to really make sense all together in a way that, this is like a non-answer, but I feel like they all exist together to inform each other. So I can't pick. Is there a follow-up?
I was gonna ask, did you mean to have a wick through the head of the first Lincoln because it kind of had a hole in the head?
He had like 20 wicks in his face. Like I was like, this is cool.
It had a
Like,
perfect hole in its head, and I was.
Say again?
It had a perfect hole in its head, and I was wondering if that had meaning behind it.
No, that's just the way, like I like these waxes because, and that was probably like, it had a sort of rod in the neck to connect, because we cast the head and shoulders were a separate mold from the rest of the body, and we poured all the body full and then attached the head onto it. So that hole's probably like from the armature that was meant to like hold it together. But I like wax and these projects. Like I always say, like I never know what to expect with a public project. Like I put it outside, I have some intentions and try to build some guardrails, but I am always surprised at what happens. Like it's impossible to predict. And same thing with wax. just kind of does its own thing.
I have a quick logistical question.
Yeah.
Right, I mean, this is like what pops in my head, it's like especially with the flag one, where people are just coming up to it, and I don't know the situation with signage or anything. But like people interacting with it, it's like, how many people come up to it, it's like, do you provide lighters, do they bring their own lighters? It's like, so many people, it's like this happened 20, 40 years ago, everyone would have a lighter.
Right.
But like,
I don't provide lighters just
Yeah.
because I don't want any extra liability.
yeah,
Like, I think at some of the opening events, like, we did bring, like, lighters, like, yeah, like, we did help that kid like that. What was the other part of the question?
yeah, I was just curious about that, of like, you know, that's, like, if I was to stumble upon this and be like, oh geez, I really wish I could light it on fire, but I don't have a lighter on me.
For sure,
Yeah.
you gotta hit that corner store.
Yeah, I was just wondering about like how many times that happened, of like,
I don't
like
know.
an unexpected consequence, right?
For sure. No, I think like a surprising number of people still do have lighters, but yeah, we don't just leave a basket of lighters.
Matchbox.
I saw it, and then we'll go here.
You mentioned the research part of your projects.
Yeah.
Is there something you focus more on than other things?
Not necessarily. I think like the research, it's kind of like, I'm assuming you've fallen down like a Wikipedia rabbit hole, but it's just kind of like one thing leads to another, and I do have other people working with me, so like my student will then debrief me on what he's been researching on, and it'll kind of connect to what I've been looking into, and then I'll be like, okay, now I'll find out about that. I think generally, like the thing I want most is like these sort of stories of, you know, like we're always, again, like in talking about Chimborazo Park or in Camp Parker, we're talking about like 2,500 people living at this camp. But there are rarely like stories written by anyone specific. And I think that's what I'm always looking for. It's like the tragedy of the record is that it often hasn't held like the true humanity of people that we're trying to remember through these projects. So it's like a general umbrella of like telling untold marginalized stories, like centered in Black history. But then like trying to get into the details and find what we can. It's always like reading in the margins of things to locate some humanity.
So I just wonder, when you were comparing the monuments, like at the beginning you talk about how they are made from bronze and they are very valuable. And often like the area around is almost sacred and you're not supposed to perform there, or you know, come closer, touch it, climb on it, paint it, whatever. And now you are in a position when you're making them, they are not permanent, and intention is not that they will be permanent, and you even include interaction. How did you initially like thought of that you wanted to see it as the opposite way, or are you referring to those space and display spaces that they don't, maybe they're not registered as well, or?
If I understand the question correctly, like the small ones were always sort of like, I felt like proposals for larger ones.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was working at a scale that I was able to, you know, get into. Like, you know, I was still a student waiting tables, so I couldn't, like this one, I'll say it was like, that's like $120,000 candle. I was making like what I had with $50. But I always imagined it, like for years I was kind of proposing like this big Lincoln. I never really knew how much it would take until I got there. Is that kind of where the question was at?
Well, I guess like the idea of interactions, like I do understand when you made the small models to kind of test it out, and then also how much, well, you invest a lot in it, like, you know, it's an expensive candle versus expensive bronze sculpture, but that one is permanent, this one is not, and it also included the interaction that we are actually encouraged to. So
Yeah.
was that always idea that you wanted that
For it to be
interaction?
temporary.
Yeah.
Absolutely. For like the wax monuments for sure. And for the skywritings, like absolutely. I think like it's
Yeah.
so much a part of like the symbolic language.
Mhm.
I am working on like a permanent memorial kind of mentioned by Tom earlier, but it's a Don't like my desktop. Well, I'll talk about it. Yeah, I'm working on like a permanent memorial for Roanoke College. It's a memorial to their enslaved laborers. They sort of gave, like it was a request for proposals. They gave us all like 2,500 or so, about 3,000 names of enslaved people who were owned by people in Roanoke. Of that list, 900 of them were owned specifically by people who sat on the board or were professors at the university, at the college. So my proposal, which if we have time I'll like find my slides, is it's gonna be stacks of bronze books. It's like, again, like 6 feet by 6 feet. Each that hold the name of one of the people who was enslaved at the college. It's called Authors and Architects. So kind of like I was saying about sort of like bringing humanity into that record, it's crediting them as authors of the space and as architects of the space, as they were. The bronze books being a way to sort of like metaphorically think about the value that they built into that space but never profited from. It sits in front of the historic library, Biddle Hall. Biddle was an enslaver, and that library was built by enslaved labor. So these people built this building but could never enter it and could never like experience like the wealth of information and the education that now we like pay into and enjoy. So that's kind of like, so I do think permanently in other things. What's on the screen now is like, I've been making these time rulers. So they are rulers that measure the length of a second at 1 mile per hour. So at 1 mile per hour, you can traverse 17.6 inches in 1 second. So that's kind of like what those rulers measure. It's like 1 second is 17.6 inches long at 1 mile per hour. And then through that, we can sort of start to coordinate space around time. So the first installation I made was called 15 Seconds to U.S. Pledge of Allegiance. It takes an average of 15 seconds to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So it's 15 red, white, and blue rulers. On the wall, each space the second part, so I guess hypothetically you could like walk that at 1 mile per hour and say the Pledge of Allegiance. But it's thinking about how that time holds space in our like collective conscience. And it's sort of a modular series that I think like now we can continue to tell times through it. The second one I made was called 10 Seconds to Remember the Murder of Eric Garner. Eric Garner was murdered in New York by NYPD. They sort of choked him for 10 seconds and he died from that altercation with the police. No one was ever charged for his murder. And in the same way, like when George Floyd's murder happened, we were thinking about Eric Garner. Like, so it's the way that these events sit in a collective memory. So this is just like another way that I'm thinking about collective memory more like I feel like this series is kind of bridging my public art and my like studio practice in a way that I'm excited about. And again, like I think there's this could tell a lot of different times, and over the course of making these, they'll start to inform each other too. So to see that like his death, his murder, his life was taken in a time that it would take you longer to say the Pledge of Allegiance than it would to take a life, I think is like remarkable, to say the least. So yeah, the Wax Monument series is temporary, so are the skywritings, but I think I work with like the space, every space differently, and sometimes it calls for a permanent acknowledgement, like the landmarker, like the memorial to the enslaved laborers, or like it needs to be a more temporary thing that doesn't hold that same space in a way that like I think colonial logic is like hold space forever, and so I think I do both. Yes.
So I'm the art historian in the faculty, so I have to apologize in advance for this kind of a question.
We forgive you.
Thank you, thank you. But I can't help looking at a work like the Free Wax piece without thinking about Jasper Johns, or these rulers thinking about Duchamp's restated stoppages. So I was just wondering how much of that is conscious or reflective or part of the conversation that you're trying to engage in, and to the extent that it is, are like Jasper Johns and Duchamp part of what you're burning down, or part of what you're kind of paying tribute to or memorializing with these works?
Yeah, I mean, of course I see like my work within an art historical context and canon. For me, those are, like, I think my favorite reference is like Felix Gonzalez Torres. Like, I like the way that he was working on a personal level to talk about the like larger political societal implications. Often there was a giveaway, often things are temporary, but at the same time there's a permanence to other ways that he's working. So that's kind of like my maybe favorite art historical reference when thinking about like what my work aspires to. But there's, yeah, I don't know if I went to Jasper Johns for wax. I think it was more like the lost wax process that really like, I was like, oh, wax is the thing to do. But of course, like, I like being in conversation with everything. Like, I think that is another sort of beauty of art, is that it is part of a cultural canon that like we can start to, like I was saying with like the public works, like I like that that thing can then become something else that I didn't intend it to be, maybe. So like the memes, like everyone was like, you know, how did the memes make you feel? Were you upset that like your work was being misinterpreted or whatever? I was like, I don't really have a standard interpretation that I want people to get from it. Like, I think it's exciting that, like, yeah, I would say like, I like my work to be like a song where it's like, I make that thing with a very personal intention, but then it's on the radio and like, you hear that thing and it's about your personal experience, right? And it becomes like your favorite song. It's totally disconnected from like the breakup that Frank Ocean was going through. It's really about like that summer that you were doing whatever. So I like that sort of memeability of art in general. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to share that I deeply love the poeticness that you bring into your pieces, and how you allow the poems to form within other people's minds. Like with the wax of Abraham Lincoln kind of like melting, and all these kids watching it over time. And yeah, there's just something of, like, for me, I get this play of like, wow, these bronze statues are like, this has always been the story, always been the story. But then to see it melting is like, oh, we've gotten this very melted, accumulated, like, mound of wax that's left of whatever historical things that did happen. The stories have been lost, the forms have been lost. And then to bring time that's usually so ephemeral into being solid and feel the time, actually feel the time as a solid moment, as more than just three-dimensional space and the four-dimensional space. And there's just as a powerful, for my body to like respond just to the photographs, and imagining what it's like for all the people who get to see your pieces and feel their imagination and their bodies shift in relationship to the piece as the piece shifts over time, or shifts within their imagination as they see time as something that has massive impact and isn't just fleeting.
Thank you.
Deeply appreciating your poetic movement in space.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I always say like, because I'm a sculptor, I'm always like, everything's sculpture, but secretly I think everything's actually poetry. Like, it starts with the poetry and then